The auditorium was filled with a palpable tension as Professor Linda Cartwright stepped onto the stage. She was not a young professor, nor was she a newcomer to the academic world. With a career spanning decades, she had taught at some of the most prestigious universities, made groundbreaking contributions to mathematics, and was regarded as an intellectual giant in her field. Yet, this was her first time standing at the lectern of this particular institution, a place where she wasn't expected, where her presence was met with skepticism and disdain. The students in the room were not like those in other classes. They were not the ones trying to climb up from the lowest rung to find opportunities. They were born at the top, most of them the children of esteemed families, destined to become leaders, scientists, or academic geniuses. They had grown up in the best schools, taught by the most elite professors, and more importantly, no one had ever challenged them. And now, a black woman stood before them as their advanced mathematics professor. To them, it was ridiculous. In the front row, Richard Whittaker sat with an air of smugness, reclining in his chair, arms crossed. His cold blue eyes locked onto Cartwright, but there was no respect in them. He was the top student in his class, the son of a famous professor on the board of the school, the one all the other professors favored because they knew one day he would rise to a position of power like his father. He smirked, his gaze dripping with mockery. A black woman teaching advanced mathematics? They must be joking, he muttered under his breath. His words went unchallenged. On the contrary, laughter erupted from the surrounding seats, shaking heads, eyes full of derision. None of them believed Cartwright had the capability to be there. None of them wanted to acknowledge her. They didn't have to do anything. They just needed to wait for Cartwright to embarrass herself. Cartwright heard it all, the mocking laughter, the impatient stares, as if they were just waiting to see her fail. But she didn't react. She simply walked quietly to the lectern, placed her briefcase on the table, and adjusted her glasses. For anyone else, this atmosphere would be a nightmare. But for Cartwright, it wasn't the first time. She was too familiar with these stares, too used to being underestimated before she even opened her mouth. And she knew exactly what to do. Whittaker crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and gave her an openly challenging look. "So, Professor, what are you going to teach us today?" Laughter bubbled up from his group of friends. Cartwright didn't respond. She simply picked up a piece of chalk, turned to the board, and wrote a series of complex equations, a system of high-level differential equations with overlapping Laplace transformations, the kind of problem that only the best could keep up with. The sharp strokes of the chalk sliced through the silence. When Cartwright set the chalk down, the lecture hall was once again silent. The once arrogant students looked up at the board, their expressions faltering. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected a black professor to be able to write out such a complex problem. But then Whittaker laughed, a cold, mocking laugh. "Interesting, but I have a question for you." He stood up, not to learn, not to absorb, but to attack. "Do you really understand what you just wrote?" Whispers filled the room. Cartwright's face didn't change, but in her eyes, there was a fire starting to burn. The game was on. The real battle had just begun. The lecture hall remained steeped in silence after Richard Whittaker's challenging question. No one moved, no one spoke. Yet there was a tension in the air like a guitar string pulled taut, just waiting for the lightest touch to snap. The students sitting near Whittaker wore knowing smiles, as if they were eagerly anticipating a dramatic scene. Cartwright remained standing, unmoved. Her gaze flickered briefly at the board before turning toward the young man, standing in front of her. He slowly walked up, each step ringing clearly in the silent space. Not in a hurry, not with impatience, but with the confidence of someone who already knows the outcome. "Professor, if we're talking about Laplace transformations, I have a question for you." Whittaker's words were not just a question. His tone carried a calculated carefulness. He wasn't overtly aggressive, but it was clear enough for everyone around to understand that he did not consider Cartwright worthy of an answer. While Cartwright may have been accustomed to skeptical glances, Whittaker was accustomed to praise. He was a genius, or at least that's what everyone told him. He had been at the top of every math competition since he was a child, always surrounded by compliments, always recognized by famous professors in the field as the future of theoretical mathematics. For Whitaker, Cartwright could never be someone of the caliber to stand here. A professor from another school, without roots in prestigious research institutes like MIT or Harvard. Not one of the names that the academic elite frequently mentioned. He didn't need to think much. There was only one possible explanation. This woman doesn't deserve it. And he would prove it, right here, right now. Whitaker said nothing more. He turned, took a piece of chalk from the tray, and wrote a long equation on the board, so complex that the students in the back had to lean forward to see it clearly. The symbols appeared quickly, neatly, each mathematical notation stacked perfectly, as though he had memorized it in advance. A nonlinear differential equation system combined with Laplace and Fourier transforms, a problem that even some veteran professors would need hours to approach properly. Whispers started to ripple through the lecture hall. Some students smirked, others eagerly nodded, while some shot challenging glances at Cartwright, because they knew what was happening. This isn't a question. This is an attack. Whitaker set the chalk down, turned around, folded his arms across his chest, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Please, Professor. No one in the lecture hall expected Cartwright to solve the problem. They didn't believe in her intellect. They wanted to see her flustered, hesitant, surrounded by helplessness. They wanted to see her realize that she didn't belong here. Some were ready to laugh. Others had snarky remarks queued up in their minds, just waiting for the moment Cartwright made a mistake. But that moment never came. Cartwright didn't change her expression. She quietly walked to the board, glancing over the problem as if it were just a regular piece of text. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, and 10 seconds. Then she took the piece of chalk. The class fell silent, not because they expected her to solve it, but because they didn't expect her to be this confident. She began writing, no hesitation, no second thoughts. Each stroke of the chalk neat, clear, and perfectly accurate. The first few strokes made some students frown. The next strokes silenced others entirely. The final lines left the whole lecture hall in stunned disbelief. It only took 3 minutes. Cartwright had solved the problem they thought no one could solve in an hour. Whitaker stood frozen. He couldn't believe his eyes. He tried to find mistake, but every line on the board was perfect, not just correct, but optimized, better than any solution he had ever known. For the first time, some students exchanged skeptical glances. They had been so accustomed to dismissing Cartwright, but now, a terrifying thought crept into their minds. Were we wrong? Cartwright set the chalk down and walked back to the desk, gazing directly at Whitaker. She didn't smile, didn't mock him, didn't need to say a word, because the truth was already crystal clear. But she knew one thing. The battle was not over. And she knew that people like Whitaker wouldn't stop just because of one small failure. If he can't defeat me with this problem, he'll try again. Cartwright understood, and she was ready. Whitaker stood there, his hand clenched by his side, his cold blue eyes fixed intently on the board where the words Cartwright had just written blazed like an undeniable insult. He couldn't believe what had just happened. In his whole life, he had never lost a battle of wits in the classroom, never encountered a professor he couldn't embarrass when he chose to, and certainly had never been defeated by someone like her. The students sitting around him could feel it too. No one was laughing anymore. No one whispered in mockery. They just sat there, some starting to glance at each other, others trying to find a logical explanation. But everyone clearly understood one thing. Cartwright was no ordinary professor. This only made it harder for Whitaker to accept. He inhaled deeply, as if trying to suppress the anger rising in his chest. To him, a math problem wasn't everything. To him, mathematics wasn't just numbers and equations. It was power. Whoever could control the most complex equations, whoever could solve the problems no one else could, that person would be at the top, recognized, celebrated, revered. And today, Cartwright had just entered his very domain. For Whitaker, this was no longer just a classroom debate. This was a war he could not lose. He squinted, curled his lip, but this time, the smile no longer held the same confidence as before. Instead, it was a bitter grin hidden beneath a facade of calmness. "It's just luck," he said, his voice dropping, no longer arrogant but still sharp and tense, like a freshly sharpened knife. "If you're really that good, solve this problem." Without waiting another second, he turned around, grabbed the chalk, and wrote a new problem on the board. This time, he wasn't simply offering a tough problem. He wanted to destroy Cartwright right on the very stage she had just claimed. As the first strokes of chalk hit the board, the class immediately noticed the difference. This was no ordinary challenge anymore. This was a doctoral-level problem, a system of nonlinear differential equations with multiple variables, combined with Laplace and Fourier transforms, intertwined with probability theory and linear algebra. A problem that could take days to find a reasonable approach. He wrote quickly, forcefully, decisively. Each stroke of the chalk seemed to carve his anger into the board, as if he were reaffirming his power. Some of the students began to smile faintly. They looked at each other and nodded, as if they had just regained the balance of the universe. This time, it's different. This problem can't be solved quickly. Let's see what she does now. A few other students, although still shaken by Cartwright's first victory, couldn't believe she could continue to win. They expected her to hesitate. They expected her to falter. They expected her to fail, because the world they knew had never had room for a professor like her. When Whitaker put the chalk down, the atmosphere in the classroom grew heavy. He turned back to face Cartwright, his eyes filled with challenge, because he was sure that this time he had backed her into an inescapable corner. But Cartwright didn't rush. She simply stood there, calmly studying the problem, as if looking at a painting, with no trace of worry or hesitation. "Do you think I'm afraid of this problem?" she said. She picked up the chalk, and for the next 10 minutes, the classroom fell completely silent, witnessing a performance that no one could believe. Each stroke of chalk appeared on the board perfectly, each line of writing executed with absolute precision. Not just a correct solution, but an approach that surpassed anything they had imagined. Cartwright wasn't just solving the problem, she was teaching. Every transformation had a reason. Every step of the calculation was optimized. Every mathematical symbol placed perfectly, with no unnecessary marks. When she finished writing the final line, the class remained still in silence. No one dared to speak. No one could deny what they had just witnessed. And Whitaker, the one who had set the problem, stood motionless, unable to say a word. He tried to find a mistake. He tried to find a flaw, but there was none. The solution was so perfect that no one could argue against it. This time, no one was smiling, because they had just witnessed the impossible happen for the second time. Whitaker's arrogance had been torn apart in the most brutal way. And that was just the beginning. The silence enveloped the classroom like a dense, heavy fog, thick with tension. No one spoke. Not a whisper could be heard, and the mocking laughter from earlier had vanished. Everyone understood that this confrontation was far from over. It couldn't end with just a math problem, not while Whitaker still stood there with clenched fists and a cold, fiery gaze, challenging everyone. He hadn't just lost once, but twice in a row, right in front of those he believed would always side with him. In the very lecture hall he had once controlled entirely. But Whitaker was not one to accept defeat easily. He couldn't let a black professor, someone he had never considered worthy, walk in and strip him of his position like this. He needed to regain control, and he needed to do it in a way that he was sure would end Cartwright once and for all. He lifted his head, trying to regain his confidence, and slowly stepped forward. His voice rang out in the silent space, sharp and calculated. "If you're really that good, would you dare compete in the national math competition?" Immediately, the lecture hall erupted. Gasps echoed everywhere. Some students were wide-eyed. Others whispered amongst themselves, but all shared the same thought. This was no longer just a classroom confrontation. This was war. Unlike the math problems on the board, the national math competition was not something anyone could just join. It was not just a test, but a battleground where the greatest minds from MIT, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford competed, and only the best could survive until the end. More importantly, it was a place where one small mistake could ruin a reputation. Cartwright knew this was a trap. Whitaker thought that if he couldn't defeat her in the classroom, he would push her into a place he was certain she wouldn't survive, a battleground where the rules of the academic elite were strictly enforced, and no matter how talented a black professor like her was, she would never be accepted as a winner. Eyes filled with expectation turned toward Cartwright, waiting to see if she would take the bait. Some students were still stunned by what they had just witnessed, but they couldn't believe she could perform the same way on a higher-level field, because this wasn't just a math problem anymore. This was a system that would fight against her. But Cartwright only smiled lightly. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no worry. She looked directly at Whitaker, her gaze calm yet deep, as if she had already seen through everything. "I'll participate." Her words rang out, simple yet powerful, like thunder that shattered the still air. The lecture hall erupted. Some students couldn't believe what they had just heard. Others turned to whisper, confused and excited. Did she really accept? No way. This is the national math competition. Does she really think she can win? The gossip spread, but one person stood still amidst it all, Whitaker. He froze. He hadn't thought she would agree. He thought she would refuse, or at least hesitate, try to avoid it. But no, she agreed immediately, without a shred of doubt, without fear. An invisible anger surged within him, but he kept his composure. "Fine," he said, his voice still dripping with sarcasm, but this time tinged with a hint of reluctance. "Then let's see if you really belong in this world." Whitaker's loyal followers nodded. Some chuckled. Others patted each other's backs, as if they had just secured the outcome for Cartwright. But deep down, even they couldn't be sure anymore, because Cartwright had proven that she was not an easy opponent to defeat. And this time, she had accepted a battle no one thought she could win. The class ended, but its aftermath lingered for days. News of Cartwright joining the national math competition spread across the campus like wildfire. No one could believe that a professor would dare to step into a battlefield reserved only for the best students, those who had dedicated their lives to preparing for this moment. Even less could they believe that she would challenge minds recognized as geniuses from the most prestigious universities in the country. In the library, in the cafes, along the long hallways, wherever students gathered, lively debates erupted over the upcoming competition. Who does she think she is? That she can beat the best in the country? Sure, Whitaker might not have beaten her in the classroom, but this competition is a whole different thing. You never know. If she can embarrass Whitaker right in front of us, who's to say she can't do the same in the competition? This isn't just about who's smarter. There, she'll be up against an entire system. Meanwhile, in a secluded corner of the main building, Whitaker stood with his loyal group of students, his eyes sharp as a knife as he gazed out into the distance. "We can't let her win," he said, his voice low and cold. "We'll make sure she never walks out of this competition as a winner." A thin smile spread across his face. "I'll make sure of that personally." The real battle had only just begun. The news of the showdown between Whitaker and Cartwright spread not only within the classroom, but throughout the entire campus, like a storm, from the long hallways of the mathematics department, through the vast library where the brightest students tirelessly studied, to the crowded coffee shop where the most passionate discussions took place. There was no place where the name Cartwright wasn't mentioned. Stories about her turned into gossip, speculation, and half-doubting, half-contemptuous remarks. Some called her crazy. Others saw her as a bizarre phenomenon. But most just viewed her as an arrogant person who didn't know her place. Does she really think she has a chance at the national math competition? Whitaker may be arrogant, but he's never lost any competition. A black professor, not from MIT or Harvard, daring to challenge genius minds? It's a joke. Voices mixed with skepticism and sarcasm echoed everywhere. For many, the national math competition wasn't just an intellectual challenge, but a test to determine who truly belonged to the elite and who didn't. And from their perspective, Cartwright didn't belong there. Not only students, but even some senior professors subtly shook their heads when they heard she was participating in the competition. They had seen Cartwright surpass Whitaker in his own classroom, but that had been a personal confrontation. Taking it to the next level, an arena where geniuses who had been trained for years competed, was something entirely different. "She's gone too far." Those words weren't just a comment, but an unspoken affirmation that Cartwright shouldn't have ventured into a battle she couldn't win. But Cartwright didn't care. She didn't need anyone to believe in her. She just needed to prove the truth. Meanwhile, Whitaker wasn't just standing idly by, waiting for the outcome of the contest. He knew that Cartwright couldn't defeat him if everything was set up according to his plan. He spent the entire night in the library, not studying math, but crafting a perfect plan to ensure Cartwright would never have a chance to shine in this competition. He wasn't just a smart student. He was the son of a professor with great influence in the National Math Competition Council, and power always finds ways to bend fairness to its will. "We won't let her win," he said to his closest friends. "I'll make sure she never walks out of this competition as the winner." His loyal followers nodded in agreement. For them, this battle was no longer just between Cartwright and Whitaker. It had become a war between an outsider and a system that had existed for centuries, and they would do anything to protect it. The waves began to roar. Cartwright knew she wasn't just fighting Whitaker. She was up against an entire system, a system built to protect people like him, a system that never wanted to see someone like her break through the invisible barriers that had been put in place. But she wasn't afraid. She wasn't in this competition to prove anything to them. She was in it for herself. She was in it because the truth didn't need anyone's permission. She was in it because this wasn't just a fight of one individual. It was a fight against a misconception that had existed for far too long. She knew the storm was rising, and she was ready to face it. The day of the exam arrived. MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford. All the most prestigious universities had representatives here. The finest mathematical minds in the country. Individuals who had spent their entire lives preparing for moments like this. The grand hall of the National Mathematics Competition was filled with tense energy, where hundreds were getting ready to engage in the most intense intellectual battle. There was no room for weakness, no room for dreamers, only mathematics, and only the best would survive until the end. As Cartwright entered the hall, the space seemed to freeze for a few seconds. Eyes immediately turned toward her. No one needed to say a word for doubt and disdain to be clearly visible on every face. In the front row, Whitaker leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He didn't need to say anything. Everyone here had thought the same as him the moment Cartwright stepped in. Time to watch her fail. Students from Ivy League schools exchanged knowing glances, quietly. In their eyes, Cartwright was not a competitor. She was an outsider, a mistake, a pointless challenge to a system that had existed for centuries. But Cartwright didn't care. She didn't look at their eyes. She only looked at the question paper before her. The real battle had begun. The hall fell into a tense silence as the judges stepped onto the stage. An elderly professor, representing the scientific council, stood in the spotlight, his voice booming. "Welcome to the first round of the National Mathematics Competition. Today, we will discover who truly deserves to be among the greatest mathematical minds." There were no friendly greetings, no polite encouragements. This was not an ordinary exam. This was a battlefield. A beep rang out as the clock began counting down on the large screen. The first problem appeared, a series of complex equations sprawled across the screen, combining multivariable integrals, matrix algebra, and statistical probability. The numbers overlapped. The mathematical symbols cluttered the board, a problem that only the brightest minds could grasp in a short time. The sound of scribbling filled the air as the contestants began writing. Some blinked a few times, trying to absorb the data, while others started solving immediately, their pens gliding across the page like musicians playing a familiar tune. Cartwright looked at the problem. She wasn't in a hurry. While other contestants had already started writing, she sat still, her eyes focused solely on the problem before her, as though she was silently peeling away its layers. In the front row, Whitaker glanced at her, his lips curling into another smirk. "She's overwhelmed." But he didn't know that Cartwright was not overwhelmed. She was analyzing the problem in a way no one else in the hall could. All around the hall, eyes continued to watch Cartwright with curiosity and skepticism. Some of the students had heard of her before, about her clash with Whitaker in university lectures, but they still couldn't believe she was actually daring to step in here. A professor is participating in this exam. Strange. Who does she think she is, competing with the best students in the country? She's probably just showing off. None of them really believed Cartwright could win. Some even hoped she made a mistake, as it would confirm that the world still operated according to its proper order. The outsiders can never surpass the invisible barriers already set in place. 3 minutes passed. 5 minutes. Cartwright still hadn't written a word, but in her mind, everything was already clear. This problem is not as hard as it seems. It's designed to disrupt thinking, to make people waste time following the wrong paths before realizing the hidden simplicity beneath. She picked up her pen. The first lines appeared on the page, not trivial calculations, not hesitant steps. She wrote down the final solution first, as if she already had the answer in her head all along. Her pen moved steadily, never hesitating. The symbols appeared with absolute precision, each transformation executed perfectly, as though she already knew exactly what to do. And then, less than 10 minutes later, she set the pen down. The other contestants were still engrossed in their calculations, some crossing things out, others checking each step they had taken. But Cartwright was done. Whitaker saw it. The confidence in his eyes vanished in the blink of an eye. He tightened his grip on the pen in his hand. It's impossible, but it's the truth. Cartwright not only finished the problem first, but she also did so with a calmness that was almost frightening. And that could only mean one thing. She knows she's right. The atmosphere in the hall became more tense than ever. Some contestants began to realize what was happening. Some turned to look at her, while others stopped just to check if they were witnessing something unbelievable right in front of them. In the air, a ripple of unease started to spread. How can she be so fast? Has she really finished already? It's impossible, right? Whispers began to rise. Whitaker still wore a smile, but it was tight forced. He couldn't believe this was happening. And he knew this was just the first problem. Cartwright didn't enter this battlefield to participate. She entered to win. The entire hall was still immersed in a tense atmosphere as the first round of the competition truly began. The contestants, the brightest minds from the most prestigious universities in the United States, dove into the exam with astonishing speed. They were accustomed to such pressures, trained to handle complex problems within a limited time. But today, something different was happening, something none of them had expected. Advanced differential equations, Fourier series, Laplace transforms, all appeared on the exam, leaving no room for hesitation or confusion. Everyone had to make use of every second, as this competition was not only testing intelligence, but also challenging one's ability to withstand pressure and solve problems quickly. In the front row, Whitaker operated like a machine. His hand moved swiftly across the paper, each line of calculation appearing accurately without a moment's hesitation. Every equation was formed in his mind as if he had seen the solution before he even picked up his pen. He didn't just want to pass the exam. He wanted to crush anyone who dared to challenge him, especially Cartwright. But there was one thing Whitaker couldn't anticipate. Cartwright was no slouch. She didn't dive into the exam at the frantic pace like the others. Instead, Cartwright skimmed through all the questions, scanning each problem as though she were observing a battle from above, analyzing the entire picture before making her move. When she started writing, what appeared on the paper was not just a correct answer, but an optimal solution. She skipped the unnecessary steps, eliminated redundant calculations, and simplified each part with such precision that it was almost unbelievable. The lines on her paper not only showed her understanding of mathematics, but also a rare finesse, a sharp, strategic thinking that not everyone possessed. Within just the first 15 minutes, Cartwright had taken the lead. Those sitting near her began to glance over. Some contestants, who had been confident in their abilities, casually peeking at her paper, as though they needed to confirm they weren't imagining things. What is she doing? No way. How could she be that fast? Is she making a mistake? The glances toward Cartwright shifted from disdain and mockery to something else, a subconscious apprehension. From the judges' section, the senior professors of the competition council began exchanging looks. They hadn't expected this. Cartwright had not only maintained her position, but she was now in the lead. That not only surprised them, it made them uncomfortable. What is she doing? One judge whispered. Impossible. This is just the first round. Maybe she's just lucky. Another shook his head, but there was a noticeable tremor in his voice. The judges had seen many exceptional contestants before, but they had never seen a professor, a person who should be on the judging side, not competing, performing the way Cartwright was right now. And that made them uneasy. Whitaker tried to stay calm, continuing to focus on his own exam. But it wasn't easy. He was used to being the best, always the leader, the one everyone admired, the one no one could surpass. But now, for the first time, he felt his position truly threatened. He wrote faster, too fast, and then he unconsciously made a mistake. A number was wrong, a parenthesis was misplaced, an unnecessary transformation step. He had to stop, erase, rewrite, check. That had never happened to him before. He glanced at Cartwright. She was still writing at a steady pace. No hint of hesitation, not a single moment of doubt. Anger surged within him. He couldn't accept this. Even though Cartwright was ahead, that didn't mean the judge's bias had changed. Some judges began to feel uncomfortable seeing her perform better than expected. They couldn't deny she was doing well, but they didn't want to accept that she could be better than their elite students. One judge, sitting in the upper row, furrowed his brow and quietly spoke to a colleague beside him. It's time to up the difficulty level. And that's exactly what they did. The first round wasn't over yet, but the next problems would be unlike any before. They were going to take things to the next level, a level they believed would be enough to break Cartwright. Cartwright felt the change in the atmosphere. She knew she was going against an entire system, and they wouldn't let her win easily. But she wasn't afraid. She had come too far to turn back. If they wanted to push her to the limit, she would show them that she had no limit. The atmosphere in the hall became tense after the first round ended. The weaker contestants had been eliminated, leaving only half of the original participants to move on to the next round. The remaining contestants were not just skilled. They were the strongest, the brightest mathematical minds America had ever trained. But even with geniuses from MIT, Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford still present, one unexpected name remained standing: Linda Cartwright. Her presence was no longer a joke. Earlier, they had thought she would be eliminated in the first round, that she was just a curious professor trying to compete with a group of brilliant students, but ultimately unable to keep up with their pace. But now, she wasn't just holding her own. She was on par with the best. Some of the eliminated contestants still sat in the audience, watching the next round unfold with incredulity. They had once been the geniuses in their own world, but now they were mere bystanders. Some were still stunned by their early exit, while others were bitter. But perhaps the strangest feeling came from seeing someone they had once underestimated now sitting at the same table as Whitaker, still fighting. Whitaker could not accept this. He had won many competitions in his life. He was used to always being the best in any exam room he entered. But today, he felt something for the first time: threat. Not because the problem was too hard, not because of the pressure, but because next to him, Cartwright was still sitting there, matching his speed. He clenched his jaw, trying to control his breath, to maintain his composure. But it wasn't easy. He had never imagined he would have to truly compete with a professor, someone he believed didn't belong there. The bell signaling the start of round 2 rang. The large electronic scoreboard above the hall flickered, and immediately, the problems for this round appeared on the screen. If the first round had been difficult, round 2 was an entirely different level. No longer were their problems solvable with standard formulas. The problems now were real challenges, combining applied mathematics, advanced calculus, abstract algebra, and mathematical concepts not even taught in any college program. The remaining contestants froze for a moment. Even Whitaker had to take a few seconds to grasp the problem. But Cartwright had no reaction. She just looked at the problem as if she had seen it before, as if she were not surprised. Then she picked up her pen and began to write. This time, Whitaker could no longer ignore her. After the first 10 minutes of round 2, the harsh filtering began. Some contestants started sweating, not because the problem was too hard, but because they realized they were wasting too much time just trying to understand the structure of the problem before even finding a solution. Some began to fidget, glancing around to check the progress of others. They were used to being the smartest in the room, but now they weren't so sure. Cartwright wasted no time. Every line that appeared on her paper was sharp and precise. No unnecessary calculations. The way she approached the problem was unlike anyone else in the hall. Other contestants were getting caught up in lengthy transformations, trying to figure out the optimal approach. But Cartwright had seen the shortest path the moment she read the problem, and that made those around her feel uneasy. A student from MIT, a contestant once considered a strong contender for first place, had to stop writing, leaning back in his seat, his eyes wide in disbelief as he stared at Cartwright. Another student from Princeton started writing faster, but his handwriting became disorganized, as if he were trying to catch up with her speed but couldn't. Those who had once believed they were the strongest now began to wonder if they really were. Whitaker was still writing. He had a clear strategy from the start. He knew this round wasn't just about mathematics. It was also a test of speed and endurance. He believed Cartwright couldn't keep up for long. But when he looked up, he saw she was still writing. No sign of fatigue. No sign of panic. No sign of someone about to collapse. And that was when, for the first time in his life, Whitaker felt fear. On the judge's bench, some exchanged worried glances. They hadn't expected this. She shouldn't have made it this far. If she keeps this up, what will happen? They knew they had to do something. They couldn't let her win. The next round would no longer be just about mathematics. They would push her to her limits. And they believed that this time, she wouldn't be able to hold on. Cartwright knew they were trying to eliminate her. She knew they wouldn't let her win easily. But she also knew one thing more important than anything else. They could change the rules of the game, but they couldn't change the truth. And the truth was she was leading.